A racist doctor named Richard rejects a black woman's treatment, convinced her swollen abdomen is nothing serious. A few days later, something happens that he never expected. The woman he declined to treat actually has a life-threatening condition. Will he find the courage to make things right? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Dr. Richard Collins strode through the hospital corridors, his white coat crisp and his posture impeccable. The click of his polished shoes echoed off the walls, announcing his presence before he even entered a room. Nurses and junior doctors scurried out of his way, their eyes cast down in a mix of respect and fear. Richard's reputation preceded him. He was known as one of the best surgeons in the country, his hands steady and his mind sharp. Patients from all over sought his expertise, and his colleagues spoke of his skills with awe. But there was another side to Dr. Collins that lurked beneath the surface of his professional success. As he approached the examination room, he glanced at the chart in his hand. His lips curled into a subtle sneer when he saw the patient's name, Gloria Johnson. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he considered a waste of his valuable time. Richard pushed open the door, his eyes immediately falling on the black woman sitting on the exam table. Gloria's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes filled with worry and hope. But Richard saw none of that. All he saw was someone he deemed unworthy of his time and skills. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice clipped and cold. "What seems to be the problem today?" Gloria began to explain her symptoms, her voice trembling slightly. "Doctor, I've been having these sharp pains in my abdomen. They've been getting worse, and I'm really worried." Richard barely listened as he flipped through her chart, his mind already made up. He cut her off mid-sentence. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm sure it's nothing serious, probably just indigestion or menstrual cramps. Have you tried over-the-counter pain relievers?" Gloria's face fell, her hopes for a thorough examination dashed. "But doctor, it feels different this time. I've never had pain like this before." Richard sighed, impatience clear in his tone. "Mrs. Johnson, I assure you, if it were anything serious, you'd know. Take some painkillers and rest. If it persists, see your regular doctor." Without waiting for a response, Richard turned on his heel and headed for the door. He had more important patients to see, ones he believed truly deserved his expertise. As he left, he missed the look of disappointment and fear that crossed Gloria's face. The next day, Gloria returned to the clinic, her face etched with pain and worry. Her hand rested on her abdomen, which was visibly swollen beneath her loose-fitting blouse. She struggled to walk, each step causing her to wince. As she entered Dr. Collins' office, Richard looked up from his desk, annoyance flashing across his face. "Mrs. Johnson, back so soon?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Gloria eased herself into the chair, her breath coming in short gasps. "Dr. Collins, please. The pain is much worse today, and my stomach, it's swollen. Something's not right." Richard leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. His eyes narrowed as he looked at Gloria, not with concern, but with disdain. "Mrs. Johnson, didn't I tell you yesterday it was nothing serious? Are you here for attention or pain medication?" Tears welled up in Gloria's eyes. "No, doctor, I'm really scared. This isn't normal for me." Richard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Listen, Mrs. Johnson, I've seen your type before. Coming from your background, I'm sure you're not used to proper medical care. But that doesn't mean you can waste my time with every little ache and pain." Gloria flinched at his words, feeling small and insignificant under his harsh gaze. She tried once more, her voice barely above a whisper. "But doctor, please just look." "Enough!" Richard cut her off. "Take some more painkillers and stop exaggerating. There are patients with real problems who need my attention." Gloria's shoulders slumped in defeat. She slowly stood up, one hand on her swollen abdomen, the other wiping away a tear. As she shuffled towards the door, Richard's voice followed her. "And Mrs. Johnson, next time, try not to be so dramatic, it's unbecoming." The door closed behind Gloria with a soft click. She stood in the hallway, feeling humiliated and disheartened. The pain in her abdomen throbbed, a constant reminder of the dismissal she had just faced. With a heavy heart and an even heavier step, Gloria made her way out of the clinic, wondering what she would do now. Emily burst through the front door, her backpack swinging wildly as she called out, "Dad, I'm home!" Her voice echoed through the spacious hallway of their suburban home. Richard emerged from his study, a tired smile on his face. "Hello, sweetheart. How was school today?" Emily's eyes lit up as she launched into an animated recount of her day. "Oh, Dad, it was amazing. Lily and I got paired up for our science project, and we're going to build a model of the solar system." Richard nodded absently, his mind still on the patients he'd seen that day. "That's nice, dear. Who's Lily again?" "Dad!" Emily rolled her eyes, exasperated. "I've told you about Lily a million times. She's my best friend." Richard chuckled, ruffling Emily's hair. Of course, I remember now." As they moved into the kitchen, Emily continued chattering excitedly. "Lily's mom is so cool, Dad. She works 2 jobs and still finds time to help us with our projects. She even offered to help us paint our planets." Richard raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "Is that so?" Emily nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, Mrs. Johnson is amazing. She's always so kind and patient, even when she looks really tired. Lily says her mom hasn't been feeling well lately, but she still makes time for everyone." Richard felt a twinge of something in his chest. Was it guilt? He quickly brushed it aside. "Well, that's very admirable of her," he said, his tone neutral. "It really is, Dad," Emily agreed, her voice filled with warmth. "Mrs. Johnson is so strong. Lily told me that even though things are tough sometimes, her mom always has a smile for everyone. She says her mom taught her that kindness doesn't cost anything." Richard listened, his expression unreadable. He had no idea that the woman his daughter was praising so highly was the same woman he had dismissed at the clinic. The irony of the situation was lost on him. "That's a good lesson," Richard said softly, more to himself than to Emily. Emily beamed at her father. "I think so too. Hey, Dad, do you think we could invite Lily and her mom over sometime? I'd love for you to meet them." Richard hesitated for a moment before forcing a smile. "We'll see, sweetheart. Now why don't you go start on your homework?" As Emily bounced off to her room, Richard stood in the kitchen, lost in thought. The image of the woman he had dismissed so callously at the clinic flickered in his mind, but he couldn't make the connection to the kind, strong mother his daughter had just described. As the days passed, Gloria's condition steadily worsened. The pain in her abdomen grew more intense, and she found it increasingly difficult to hide her discomfort from Lily. Each morning, she forced herself out of bed, wincing as she moved, determined to carry on with her daily responsibilities. "Mom, are you okay?" Lily asked one morning, her big brown eyes filled with concern. Gloria mustered a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, sweetie. Just a little tired, that's all." But the truth was far from okay. Gloria's body ached, and she felt a constant, gnawing pain that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Still, she pushed through, refusing to let her daughter see her struggle. At work, Gloria found herself taking more frequent breaks, leaning against walls for support when the pain became too much. Her co-workers noticed her pale complexion and the beads of sweat that often dotted her forehead, but Gloria brushed off their concerns with a weak smile. "I'm fine," she'd say, even as she gripped the edge of her desk to steady herself. As she prepared dinner one evening, a sharp pain shot through her abdomen, causing her to drop a plate. It shattered on the floor, the sound bringing Lily running into the kitchen. "Mom!" Lily cried, seeing her mother doubled over in pain. Gloria straightened up quickly, forcing a laugh. "Oh, silly me, just dropped a plate, sweetie. Could you grab the broom for me?" Lily hesitated, her eyes searching her mother's face. "Are you sure you're okay?" "Of course, honey," Gloria lied, her heart breaking at the worry in her daughter's voice. "Now, go finish your homework while I clean this up." Later that night, after Lily had gone to bed, Gloria sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. She knew she needed medical help, but the thought of returning to Dr. Collins's clinic filled her with dread. His dismissive words and cruel assumptions echoed in her mind, bringing tears to her eyes. "I can't go back there," she whispered to herself, her voice choked with emotion. "I just can't." But as another wave of pain washed over her, Gloria realized she was running out of options. She needed help, but the fear of facing Dr. Collins again paralyzed her. Torn between her deteriorating health and her wounded pride, Gloria felt more desperate and alone than ever before. Gloria's condition continued to deteriorate over the next few days. She tried her best to hide her pain from Lily and her co-workers, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. At work, she moved slower, her face pale and drawn as she struggled through each task. On a particularly busy morning at the diner where she worked, Gloria felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her abdomen. She gasped, clutching the counter for support. Her co-worker, Jenny, rushed over to her. "Gloria, are you all right?" Jenny asked, her voice filled with concern. Gloria opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The room began to spin, and her vision blurred. She felt her knees buckle beneath her. "Gloria!" Jenny cried out as Gloria collapsed to the floor. The diner erupted in chaos. Customers gasped and stood up from their seats while Gloria's co-workers rushed to her side. Jenny knelt beside her, gently patting her cheek. "Gloria, can you hear me?" she called, but Gloria's eyes remained closed. "Someone call an ambulance," the diner's manager shouted. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. Paramedics burst through the diner's doors, quickly assessing Gloria's condition. They carefully lifted her onto a stretcher and rushed her to the waiting ambulance. At the hospital's emergency room, doctors and nurses swarmed around Gloria. They ran tests, drew blood, and conducted scans. The medical team's faces grew increasingly serious as they reviewed the results. Dr. Lara Chen, the lead physician, frowned as she studied Gloria's charts. "This is far more severe than we initially thought," she muttered to her team. "We need to admit her immediately and prepare for emergency treatment." As they wheeled Gloria towards the intensive care unit, she briefly regained consciousness. Her eyes fluttered open, filled with fear and confusion. "Lily," she whispered weakly. "My daughter." A kind-faced nurse squeezed her hand. "Don't worry, we'll contact your family. You're in good hands now." Gloria's eyes closed again as the medical team continued their urgent work, racing against time to save her life. As Richard made his rounds at the hospital, Dr. Chen approached him with a concerned look on her face. "Dr. Collins, we have a critical case I'd like you to consult on," she said, her voice urgent. Richard sighed, barely glancing up from his clipboard. "What is it, Dr. Chen? I'm quite busy." "It's a woman named Gloria. She was admitted with severe abdominal pain and swelling. We believe it might be a complicated case requiring your expertise." Richard's eyebrows furrowed slightly. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. "Gloria who?" he asked, his tone dismissive. Dr. Chen flipped through her notes. "Gloria Johnson. Her condition is rapidly deteriorating, and we're worried about potential complications." Richard's mind flashed back to the woman he had dismissed at his clinic. A twinge of discomfort flickered across his face, but he quickly masked it. "I see," he said coldly. "And why exactly do you need my input?" Just then a nurse rushed up to them, her eyes wide with urgency. "Dr. Chen, the patient in room 305 is asking for her daughter. She's very distressed." Dr. Chen nodded. "That's Gloria. Her daughter's name is Lily. We're trying to contact her now." At the mention of Lily's name, Richard froze. His heart began to race as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Lily, his daughter Emily's best friend. The kind, strong mother Emily had praised. It was Gloria. Richard felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He gripped his clipboard tightly, his knuckles turning white. The weight of his earlier dismissal and prejudice crashed down on him, threatening to overwhelm him. Dr. Chen and the nurse looked at him expectantly, waiting for his response. Richard took a deep breath, forcing his face to remain impassive. He couldn't let his colleagues see the turmoil raging inside him. I'll review her case," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Send me all the relevant information, and I'll see what I can do." Dr. Chen nodded, relief evident on her face. "Thank you, Dr. Collins. We appreciate your expertise on this. As they walked away, Richard stood rooted to the spot, his mind reeling. The gravity of his actions and their potential consequences began to sink in, leaving him feeling hollow and ashamed. Emily burst into the house, her face flushed with worry. She found her father, Richard, sitting in his study, staring blankly at his computer screen. "Dad!" she cried, her voice trembling. "Something terrible has happened." Richard looked up, startled by his daughter's distress. "What is it, Emily? What's wrong?" Emily's eyes welled up with tears. "It's Lily's mom, Gloria. She's in the hospital, and it's really bad. Lily's so scared, Dad. She doesn't know what to do." Richard felt his stomach twist into knots. He tried to keep his face neutral, but his heart raced as he remembered his earlier encounter with Gloria. "That's unfortunate," he said, his voice strained. "I'm sure the doctors at the hospital are taking good care of her." Emily shook her head, frustration evident in her eyes. "Dad, you don't understand. Gloria is amazing. She's done so much for Lily, all on her own. Did you know she works 2 jobs just to make sure Lily has everything she needs?" Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I didn't know that," he mumbled. "And she's always there for everyone," Emily continued, her voice full of admiration. "Last month, when Mrs. Rodriguez down the street was sick, Gloria cooked meals for her whole family. She's just so kind, Dad. She doesn't deserve this." As Emily spoke, Richard felt a growing weight in his chest. The image of Gloria he had constructed in his mind began to crumble, replaced by the reality of a hard-working, selfless mother. "Lily told me once that her mom sometimes skips meals so she can afford Lily's school supplies," Emily said softly, wiping away a tear. "But she never complains. She always has a smile on her face, no matter how tough things get." Richard swallowed hard, trying to push down the guilt that was rising in his throat. He remembered the dismissive way he had treated Gloria, the assumptions he had made based solely on her appearance and background. I'm sure she'll be fine," Richard said, his voice lacking conviction. "The hospital has excellent doctors." Emily looked at her father, her eyes pleading. "Can't you do something, Dad? You're a great doctor. Maybe you could help?" Richard felt a twinge of panic. He wanted to help, to make things right, but the shame of his earlier actions held him back. He tried to dismiss the feeling, to rationalize his behavior, but Emily's words kept echoing in his mind. I'll see what I can find out," he said finally, unable to meet his daughter's gaze. Richard walked into the hospital conference room, his footsteps heavy with dread. The medical team treating Gloria was already gathered around the table, their faces serious as they pored over her charts. "Dr. Collins," one of the doctors greeted him. "Thank you for joining us. We'd like your input on this case." Richard nodded stiffly, taking a seat at the table. He reached for Gloria's medical file, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. As he scanned the pages, his heart sank. The symptoms were all there, clear as day. The swollen abdomen, the pain, the fatigue, all signs he had dismissed when Gloria had come to his clinic. "Patient presented with severe abdominal pain and distension," another doctor was saying. "CT scan revealed a large tumor in her ovary with signs of metastasis." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He remembered Gloria sitting in his office, her face etched with discomfort, pleading for help. And he had sent her away with nothing more than a dismissive wave and a cruel remark. "How?" Richard's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "How advanced is it?" The lead oncologist shook her head. "Stage 3. If it had been caught earlier, her prognosis would have been much better. As it stands now, we're looking at aggressive treatment just to give her a fighting chance." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He had done this. His prejudice, his arrogance, his utter failure as a doctor. It had all led to this moment. He had sworn an oath to do no harm, and yet his negligence had almost cost Gloria her life. "Dr. Collins," one of the younger doctors was looking at him with concern. "Are you all right?" Richard realized he had been staring blankly at the file, his hands shaking. He looked up at the team, seeing the confusion and worry on their faces. They had no idea of his involvement, of the weight of guilt crushing down on him. He started, then stopped. What could he say? How could he possibly explain or justify his actions? Richard took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I'd like to take on this case personally," he announced, his voice firmer than he felt inside. The room fell silent. Richard Collins, known for his selective approach to patients, was volunteering to treat someone he would typically avoid? It was unprecedented. "Are you sure, Dr. Collins?" the lead oncologist asked, her eyebrows raised in surprise. "We have several other specialists who—" "I'm sure." Richard cut her off, perhaps too sharply. He softened his tone. I believe I'm the best equipped to handle this case." His colleagues exchanged glances but nodded in agreement. After all, Richard's surgical skills were unmatched. As the meeting concluded, Richard remained seated, staring at Gloria's file. The face of the woman he had dismissed so cruelly now haunted him. He could see her eyes filled with pain and desperation, silently pleading for help. A war raged inside him. Years of ingrained prejudice battled against the stark reality of his failure as a doctor. He had let his personal biases cloud his judgment, and now a woman, a mother, was fighting for her life because of it. "This isn't about race," he muttered to himself, trying to convince his own stubborn mind. "This is about being a doctor, about saving a life." As he walked out of the conference room, Richard noticed the curious glances from the hospital staff. Word had already spread about his unusual decision to take on Gloria's case. He could hear the whispers, see the raised eyebrows. Dr. Martinez, a colleague he often consulted with, approached him in the hallway. "Richard, are you feeling all right? It's not like you to—" Richard cut him off with a curt nod. "I'm fine, thank you. Just doing my job." But he wasn't fine. With each step towards Gloria's room, the weight of his guilt grew heavier. How could he face her? How could he look into the eyes of the woman he had failed so miserably? As he reached for the door handle, Richard paused. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and silently promised himself, and Gloria, that he would do everything in his power to make this right. Richard hesitated outside Gloria's hospital room, his hand frozen on the doorknob. He could hear soft voices inside, young, worried voices. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. 2 girls sat by Gloria's bedside, holding hands. One was his daughter Emily, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. The other, a young African-American girl, could only be Lily, Gloria's daughter. "Dad?" Emily looked up, surprised to see him there. Richard cleared his throat. "Hello, girls. I wanted to check on the patient." Lily's eyes widened. "Are you Mom's doctor?" she asked, her voice trembling. Richard nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "I am, and I promise you we're doing everything we can for her." Lily's lip quivered. "She's always taking care of me. Even when she was sick, she never stopped. She'd make my lunch, help me with homework." Her voice broke. "I should have known something was wrong." Emily squeezed her friend's hand. "Your mom's the bravest person I know, Lily. Remember when she helped us with the bake sale? She stayed up all night making cupcakes, even though she had work the next day." Richard listened, a lump forming in his throat. He'd dismissed Gloria so easily, seeing her only as a stereotype. But here was a woman who put everyone else first, who pushed through pain to care for her child. "She never complains," Lily said softly. "Even when things are hard, she always says we have so much to be thankful for." Richard felt a wave of shame wash over him. He'd been so wrong, so terribly wrong. Gloria wasn't just a patient, she was a mother, a friend, a pillar of strength for these girls. "Your mother sounds like an extraordinary woman," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry she's going through this." The girls looked at him, hope shining in their tear-filled eyes. In that moment, Richard made a silent vow. He would do everything in his power to save Gloria, not just as a doctor, but as a human being who finally understood the value of compassion. Richard stood by Gloria's bedside, watching her chest rise and fall with each labored breath. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the room, a constant reminder of how close they'd come to losing her. He couldn't shake the memory of their first meeting, his harsh words echoing in his mind. "You people always exaggerate," he had said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I'm sure it's nothing serious." Now, looking at Gloria's pale face, Richard felt a wave of shame wash over him. How could he have been so blind, so cruel? He had let his prejudice cloud his judgment, nearly costing this woman her life. Richard sank into the chair beside her bed, burying his face in his hands. He thought of Lily and Emily, their faces full of worry and love for Gloria. He thought of all the times Gloria had pushed through her pain to care for others, never once complaining. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, though he knew Gloria couldn't hear him. "I was wrong. So terribly wrong." As he sat there, Richard made a silent vow. He would do everything in his power to make this right. It wasn't just about saving Gloria's life anymore, it was about becoming the kind of doctor, the kind of person he should have been all along. Richard stood up, a new determination in his eyes. He walked to the nurse's station, requesting Gloria's complete medical history and all recent test results. He would review every detail, consult with specialists if needed, and ensure she received the best possible care. As he pored over her charts, Richard felt a change stirring within him. The walls of prejudice he had built over years began to crumble. He saw Gloria not as a stereotype, but as a human being, strong, loving, and deserving of respect. "I'll make this right," Richard promised himself. "For Gloria, for Lily, and for every patient I've ever misjudged." Richard took a deep breath and gathered the medical team in the conference room. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on the tired faces of the doctors and nurses who had been working tirelessly on Gloria's case. Richard stood at the head of the table, his usual air of superiority replaced by a determined focus. "All right, everyone," he began, his voice firm but gentle. "We need to give Gloria our absolute best. Let's go over her case from the beginning." For hours, they pored over Gloria's medical history, test results, and current condition. Richard listened intently to each team member's input, asking questions and encouraging discussion. It was a side of him his colleagues had rarely seen before. "Dr. Collins," one of the younger doctors said, surprise evident in her voice, "I've never seen you so invested in a patient before." Richard paused, his eyes softening. "This case, it's opened my eyes to a lot of things," he admitted. "We can't afford to make any mistakes." As the days passed, Richard's dedication to Gloria's care became legendary in the hospital. He was often seen checking on her late into the night, adjusting her treatment plan, and consulting with specialists from around the country. One evening, as Richard sat by Gloria's bedside reviewing her latest lab results, a nurse approached him. "Dr. Collins, you should go home and rest," she said gently. "You've been here for almost 48 hours straight." Richard shook his head, his eyes never leaving the chart in his hands. "I can't leave yet. There's still so much to do." The nurse placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing everything you can, doctor. Gloria is in good hands." Richard finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of determination and remorse. "I owe her this," he said softly. "I owe her so much more than this." As he turned back to Gloria's sleeping form, Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for Gloria's life anymore. He was fighting for a chance at redemption, for an opportunity to become the doctor and the person he should have been all along. As Richard's dedication to Gloria's case intensified, whispers began to circulate among the hospital staff. His colleagues, accustomed to his aloof and often dismissive demeanor, couldn't help but notice the drastic change in his attitude. Dr. Maria Fields, a fellow surgeon, approached Dr. James Miller in the break room. "Have you seen Richard lately?" she asked, her voice low. "He's like a different person." Dr. Miller nodded, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "It's strange, isn't it? I've never seen him so invested in a patient before." "Do you think it has something to do with his daughter?" Maria wondered aloud. "I heard the patient's daughter is friends with Emily." James shrugged. "Could be. It's hard to imagine Richard suddenly developing a conscience after all these years. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Lisa Chenz, who had overheard their exchange. "I don't know," she said, joining them. "I've been working closely with Richard on Gloria's case, and it seems genuine to me. He's been pulling all-nighters, consulting with specialists. I've never seen him work so hard." Maria remained skeptical. "Maybe he's just trying to save face. You know how important his reputation is to him." As the days passed, the speculation continued. Some staff members admired Richard's newfound dedication, while others questioned his motives. However, Richard remained oblivious to the gossip swirling around him. His focus was solely on Gloria's recovery. One evening, as Richard was leaving Gloria's room after a routine check, he overheard two nurses talking in hushed tones. "I bet he's only doing this because of his daughter's friend," one nurse whispered. "It's not like him to care about patients like this." Richard paused, his hand on the doorknob. For a moment, he felt a flicker of anger at their assumptions. But then, he remembered his own past behavior and realized he couldn't blame them for their doubts. Taking a deep breath, Richard straightened his white coat and walked past the nurses with a polite nod. He didn't have time to worry about what others thought. Gloria's life hung in the balance, and he was determined to do everything in his power to save her. As Richard arrived home late one evening, exhausted from another long day at the hospital, he found Sarah waiting for him in the kitchen. The warm aroma of a home-cooked meal filled the air, but Richard's mind was still preoccupied with Gloria's case. "Richard, honey," Sarah said softly, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "You've been so distant lately. What's going on?" Richard sighed, his shoulders sagging as he sank into a chair at the kitchen table. I've made a terrible mistake, Sarah," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah sat down beside him, her brow furrowed with concern. "What do you mean?" Richard took a deep breath and began to explain everything. His initial dismissal of Gloria, the prejudice that had clouded his judgment, and the guilt that now consumed him. As he spoke, his voice trembled with emotion. "I could have cost her her life, Sarah," he said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And for what? Because of my own stupid biases?" Sarah listened intently, her hand resting comfortingly on Richard's. When he finished, she squeezed his hand gently. "Oh, Richard," she said softly. "I'm so proud of you for recognizing your mistake and trying to make it right." Richard looked up at her, surprised. "You're not disappointed in me?" Sarah shook her head. "We all make mistakes, Richard. What matters is how we choose to learn from them and grow. You're doing the right thing now, and that's what's important." Her words seemed to lift a weight from Richard's shoulders. I want to do better," he admitted. "Not just for Gloria, but for all my patients." Sarah smiled warmly. "That's the Richard I married," she said. "The compassionate doctor who wanted to help people. Remember why you became a surgeon in the first place?" Richard nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "To save lives and make a difference." "Exactly," Sarah said. "And that's what you're doing now. Don't let anyone's doubts, including your own, stop you from doing what's right." As the days passed, Gloria's condition began to show signs of improvement. The swelling in her abdomen decreased, and her vital signs stabilized. Richard spent countless hours at her bedside, meticulously monitoring her progress and adjusting her treatment plan as needed. One afternoon, as Gloria slowly regained consciousness, her eyes fluttered open to find Richard checking her IV. She blinked in confusion, recognizing him as the doctor who had dismissed her concerns so callously before. "Dr. Collins?" she whispered, her voice weak but filled with surprise. Richard turned to her, his face softening with relief. "Gloria, you're awake. How are you feeling?" Gloria hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The memory of their previous encounter still stung, but there was something different about Richard now. His eyes held a warmth she hadn't seen before. "I'm better, I think," she said cautiously. "But why are you here?" Richard took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Gloria, I owe you an apology. My behavior during your clinic visit was inexcusable. I've been overseeing your care since you were admitted, and I promise you I'm doing everything in my power to help you recover." Gloria studied his face, searching for any sign of insincerity. To her surprise, she found only genuine concern and remorse. "I don't understand," she said softly. "What changed?" Richard pulled up a chair and sat beside her bed. "I realized how wrong I was," he explained, his voice filled with emotion. "I let my prejudices cloud my judgment, and I nearly cost you your life. I'm so sorry, Gloria. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm committed to your full recovery." Gloria's eyes welled with tears. She had never expected to hear such words from the arrogant doctor she had first met. As she watched Richard tenderly adjust her pillows and check her vitals, she felt a glimmer of trust begin to form. "Thank you, Dr. Collins," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I appreciate your honesty and your care." Richard smiled softly, relief washing over his features. "You can call me Richard," he said gently. "And thank you, Gloria, for giving me a chance to make things right." As Gloria rested, Richard stepped out of her room, his mind whirling with thoughts of redemption and change. He found Emily waiting in the hallway, her young face etched with concern. "Dad," Emily said softly, "can we talk?" Richard nodded, leading her to a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria. They sat down, and Emily took a deep breath, her eyes meeting her father's. "Dad, I know about how you treated Lily's mom before," Emily began, her voice trembling slightly. "Lily told me everything." Richard felt a pang of shame wash over him. He lowered his gaze, unable to meet his daughter's eyes. "Emily, No, Dad, please listen," Emily interrupted gently. "I know you're trying to make things right now, but I need you to understand something important." Richard looked up, seeing the determination in his daughter's eyes. He nodded, encouraging her to continue. "A doctor's job is to help everyone, Dad," Emily said, her voice growing stronger. "It doesn't matter where they come from or what they look like. Your duty is to serve everyone equally, without prejudice." Her words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He had always prided himself on being an excellent surgeon, but he realized now that he had been failing in the most fundamental aspect of his profession. "You're right, Emily," Richard admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been so wrong for so long." Emily reached out and took her father's hand. "It's not too late to change, Dad. You're already starting to. I've seen how hard you're working to help Mrs. Johnson now." Richard squeezed his daughter's hand, feeling a mix of shame and pride. Shame for his past actions, but pride in his daughter's wisdom and compassion. "I promise you, Emily," Richard said, his voice filled with determination. "I'm going to do better, not just for Gloria, but for every patient who needs my help. I've been blind to my own prejudices for too long." Emily smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "That's all I wanted to hear, Dad. I know you can be the kind of doctor that makes a real difference in people's lives." As they sat there hand in hand, Richard felt a profound shift within himself. His daughter's words had struck a chord, awakening him to the true meaning of his calling as a doctor. He knew that this conversation would be a turning point in his life, both professionally and personally. Richard left the cafeteria, Emily's words echoing in his mind. As he walked through the hospital corridors, he felt the weight of his past actions pressing down on him. He paused by a window, looking out at the bustling city below, his reflection staring back at him with haunted eyes. How many patients had he dismissed over the years? How many lives could he have changed if he'd only set aside his prejudices? The questions swirled in his mind, each one a painful reminder of his failings. He thought of Gloria lying in her hospital bed fighting for her life. If he had taken her seriously from the beginning, she might not be in this situation. The realization made his stomach churn with guilt. Richard leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. He saw faces, countless faces of patients he had treated with disdain or indifference. Some he had helped despite his attitude, but others he had turned away or given subpar care. Each face was a testament to his failure as a doctor and as a human being. Opening his eyes, Richard straightened his back. He knew what he had to do. Helping Gloria wasn't enough. It was just the beginning. He needed to make broader changes, not just in how he treated patients, but in how the entire hospital operated. With renewed determination, Richard strode towards his office. He would start by reviewing his past cases, reaching out to patients he had mistreated. It would be humbling and painful, but necessary. He would offer free follow-up care, ensure they received the treatment they deserved. But it couldn't stop there. Richard realized he needed to address the systemic issues in the hospital. He would propose diversity training for all staff, push for more inclusive hiring practices, and advocate for outreach programs in underserved communities. As he sat at his desk, Richard began drafting a plan. It would be a long, challenging journey, but he was committed to seeing it through. He owed it to Gloria, to Emily, and to every patient he had ever failed. Richard took a deep breath as he approached the hospital room where Lily was waiting. He had spoken with children before, but this felt different. The weight of his past mistakes and the gravity of Gloria's condition made this conversation crucial. As he entered the room, he saw Lily sitting on a chair, her small legs dangling above the floor. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but she looked up at him with a glimmer of hope. "Hello, Lily," Richard said softly, kneeling down to her level. "I'm Dr. Collins. I'm taking care of your mom." Lily nodded, her lower lip trembling slightly. "Is my mommy going to be okay?" Richard felt a lump in his throat. He reached out and gently took Lily's hand. "Lily, I want you to know that I'm doing everything I can to help your mother. She's very sick, but she's also very strong." Lily's eyes widened. "Really? You promise you're doing everything?" Richard nodded solemnly. "I promise. Your mom is getting the best care possible, and I'm working with a whole team of doctors to make her better." Lily's face brightened a little. "Thank you, Dr. Collins. My mommy always says that doctors are like superheroes. They make people better when they're sick." Richard felt a pang in his chest at Lily's innocent words. He had been far from a superhero, but he was determined to live up to that ideal now. "Your mom is right, Lily. We do our best to help people, and I promise you I'm doing my very best for your mom." Lily surprised Richard by throwing her arms around his neck in a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered. "I know you'll make her better." As Richard hugged her back, he felt overwhelmed by the trust this little girl was placing in him. Her faith in his abilities and her unwavering belief that he would save her mother touched him deeply. When Lily pulled away, Richard saw a spark of hope in her eyes that hadn't been there before. It filled him with a renewed sense of purpose and determination. "Lily," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "I promise you that I will do everything in my power to help your mom get better. We're going to fight this together, okay?" Lily nodded, a small smile appearing on her face. "Okay, Dr. Collins. I believe in you." As the days passed, Richard found himself spending more and more time at Gloria's bedside. He monitored her progress closely, adjusting her treatment plan with meticulous care. Slowly but surely, Gloria's condition began to improve. One afternoon, as Richard was checking Gloria's vitals, she stirred and opened her eyes. "Dr. Collins," she said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard smiled gently. "How are you feeling today, Gloria?" "A little better," she replied. "Thank you for taking care of me." Richard felt a twinge of guilt at her gratitude. "It's my job," he said softly. "I'm sorry I didn't do it properly before." Gloria looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and understanding. "We all make mistakes, Dr. Collins. What matters is how we learn from them." Her words touched Richard deeply. He pulled up a chair and sat beside her bed. "Can you tell me more about yourself, Gloria? About your life?" Over the next few days, as Gloria grew stronger, she shared her story with Richard. She told him about growing up in a poor neighborhood, about the struggles she faced as a single mother, and about her dreams for Lily's future. Richard listened intently, his heart heavy with each revelation. He began to see Gloria not just as a patient, but as a strong, resilient woman who had overcome incredible odds. "You know," Gloria said one day, "I've always believed that everyone deserves a second chance. Even when life knocks you down, you have to get back up and keep trying." Richard nodded, his eyes misty. "You're an incredibly strong person, Gloria. I admire your resilience." As they talked, Richard found himself developing a deep respect for Gloria. Her kindness, despite the hardships she had faced, humbled him. He realized how narrow-minded and unfair his initial judgment had been. With each passing day, Gloria's condition improved and Richard's understanding of her life deepened. He began to see the world through her eyes, and it changed him in ways he never expected. As Gloria's health continued to stabilize, Richard found himself spending more time reflecting on the profound changes he had undergone. Sitting in his office late one evening, he gazed out the window at the twinkling city lights, his mind swirling with thoughts and emotions. He remembered the first time Gloria had come to his clinic, how he had dismissed her concerns with cruel indifference. The memory made him wince, a sharp pang of regret piercing his heart. But now, as he pictured Gloria's face, he saw more than just a patient. He saw a strong, resilient woman who had faced countless hardships with grace and determination. Richard leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He thought about the conversations they had shared over the past few weeks, about Gloria's struggles and triumphs, her hopes and fears. Each story had chipped away at the walls of prejudice he had built around himself, revealing the common humanity that connected them all. "I've been so blind," Richard whispered to himself, shaking his head. He stood up and walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. In that moment, Richard made a silent vow to himself and to Gloria. He promised to carry these lessons forward in his career, to treat every patient with the dignity and respect they deserved, regardless of their background or circumstances. "No more judgments," he said softly. "No more assumptions." Richard felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he made this commitment. He realized that in helping Gloria heal, he had begun to heal something within himself too. The prejudices that had once seemed so deeply ingrained now felt foreign and shameful. As he turned back to his desk, Richard's eyes fell on a framed photo of his daughter, Emily. He picked it up, smiling as he remembered her words about a doctor's duty to serve everyone equally. She had seen the truth so clearly while he had been lost in his own biases. "Thank you, Emily," he murmured, setting the photo down gently. "And thank you, Gloria." As the day of Gloria's discharge arrived, Richard felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. He had spent weeks overseeing her care, and now it was time for her to return home. He wanted to ensure that everything was perfect for her continued recovery. Richard entered Gloria's hospital room, clipboard in hand. Gloria was sitting on the edge of her bed, dressed in comfortable clothes, a small smile on her face. "Good morning, Gloria," Richard said warmly. "Are you ready to head home?" Gloria nodded, her eyes bright with anticipation. "More than ready, Dr. Collins. I can't wait to see Lily." Richard's heart swelled at the mention of Gloria's daughter. He had come to admire the bond between mother and child. "Before you go, I want to go over your discharge instructions," Richard said, pulling up a chair. He sat down, making sure he was at eye level with Gloria. For the next half hour, Richard carefully explained Gloria's medication schedule, dietary restrictions, and the importance of rest. He spoke slowly and clearly, making sure Gloria understood every detail. "Remember, no heavy lifting for at least 6 weeks," Richard emphasized. "And if you experience any unusual pain or discomfort, call me immediately." Gloria listened attentively, nodding her understanding. When Richard finished, she reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Dr. Collins, for everything." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. He cleared it quickly and stood up. "I've also arranged for some additional support," he said. "A home health nurse will visit twice a week to check on you, and I've set up meal deliveries for the first month." Gloria's eyes widened in surprise. "Dr. Collins, that's too much. I can't afford—" Richard held up his hand, stopping her. "It's all taken care of, Gloria. Your job now is to focus on getting better." Tears welled up in Gloria's eyes. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Richard replied softly. "Just get well." As a nurse entered with a wheelchair, Richard helped Gloria into it. He watched as she was wheeled out of the room, feeling a sense of accomplishment and humility. He knew that Gloria's journey to recovery was far from over, but he was determined to be there every step of the way. As Gloria sat in the wheelchair ready to leave the hospital, she turned to Richard with a warm smile. Her eyes, once filled with fear and uncertainty, now shone with gratitude and hope. "Dr. Collins," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done for me." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected this moment to be so emotional. "It's my job, Gloria," he replied, trying to maintain his composure. Gloria shook her head gently. "No, it's more than that. I've seen the change in you, Dr. Collins. When I first came to your clinic, I felt invisible. But now, I feel seen and cared for." Richard's cheeks flushed with shame as he remembered their first encounter. He opened his mouth to apologize, but Gloria continued. "I hope," she said, her eyes locked on his, "that you'll continue to treat all your patients with the same care and respect you've shown me. Every person who walks through your door deserves that." Her words struck Richard deeply. He realized that Gloria wasn't just thanking him, she was challenging him to be better, to do better. "I will, Gloria," Richard promised, his voice thick with emotion. "I give you my word." Gloria reached out and squeezed his hand. "Then you'll be the great doctor I know you can be." As the nurse began to wheel Gloria away, Richard felt a profound shift within himself. Gloria's words had solidified his resolve to change, not just for her, but for all his future patients. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to live up to the faith Gloria had placed in him. Richard arrived home that evening, his mind still reeling from the day's events. As he stepped through the front door, he was greeted by the warm smiles of Sarah and Emily, who were eagerly waiting to hear about Gloria's discharge. "How did it go, Dad?" Emily asked, her eyes bright with anticipation. Richard took a deep breath and joined his family in the living room. "It went well," he began, his voice filled with a mix of emotions. "Gloria's recovery has been remarkable. She's strong, both in body and spirit." Sarah reached out and squeezed her husband's hand, sensing there was more to the story. "But it's not just about her physical recovery," Richard continued, his voice growing softer. "Gloria taught me something important today. She thanked me, but she also challenged me to be better." Emily leaned forward, her expression serious. "What do you mean, Dad?" Richard looked at his daughter, feeling a swell of pride at her compassion. "She reminded me of the importance of treating every patient with respect and dignity, regardless of who they are or where they come from." Emily's face lit up with a smile. "That's exactly what I've been trying to tell you, Dad. I'm so proud of you for listening and learning." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. "You're right, Emily, and I want you to know that I'm grateful for your influence. You and your mother, and even Gloria and Lily, you've all helped me see things differently." Sarah wrapped an arm around her husband's shoulders. "We're here to support you, Richard. Change isn't easy, but it's worth it." Emily nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. And remember, Dad, kindness and compassion aren't just for special cases. They should be for everyone, always." Richard looked at his daughter, marveling at her wisdom beyond her years. "You're absolutely right, Emily. I've learned so much from all of you. I promise to carry these lessons with me every day, with every patient I see." As the family continued their discussion, Richard felt a profound sense of gratitude. He realized that his transformation wasn't just about becoming a better doctor, but about becoming a better person, and he had the amazing women in his life to thank for guiding him on this journey. The following morning, Richard woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. As he prepared for work, he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do more. The lessons he had learned from Gloria's case and his family's support had ignited a spark within him. During his morning rounds at the hospital, Richard found himself looking at his patients differently. He saw beyond their illnesses, recognizing each person's unique story and struggles. This new perspective weighed heavily on his heart, especially when he encountered patients who were clearly struggling to afford their medical care. As he sat in his office later that day, Richard made a decision that would change the course of his career. He picked up the phone and called for an emergency staff meeting. When his colleagues gathered in the conference room, they were surprised by the determination in Richard's eyes. He stood at the head of the table, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "I've called you all here today because I have a proposal," Richard said, his voice steady and clear. "I want to open a clinic in the underserved area of our city to provide free medical care to those who cannot afford it." A hushed murmur spread through the room. Dr. Thompson, one of the senior surgeons, raised an eyebrow. "Richard, this is unexpected. What brought this on?" Richard smiled softly. "Recent events have opened my eyes to the real struggles many people face when it comes to healthcare. We have the skills and resources to make a difference. I believe it's our duty to do so." As Richard explained his vision for the clinic, he could see the surprise on his colleagues' faces slowly turn to interest. Dr. Chen, a young resident, was the first to speak up. "I think it's a wonderful idea, Dr. Collins," she said enthusiastically. "I'd be honored to volunteer my time at the clinic." One by one, other doctors and nurses began to voice their support. Some offered to help with logistics, while others volunteered their medical expertise. Richard felt a warmth spread through his chest as he realized his colleagues were not only surprised by his decision, but inspired by it. Dr. Thompson, who had initially seemed skeptical, stood up. "Richard, I have to admit I never expected this from you, but I'm impressed by your initiative. Count me in." As word spread about Richard's new initiative, he found himself inundated with messages from medical professionals across the city. Many were inspired by his vision of providing compassionate care to all, regardless of their background. Richard realized that he needed to carefully select a team that shared his newfound values and commitment. One sunny afternoon, Richard sat in his office poring over applications and resumes. He wanted to ensure that each person he brought on board truly understood the importance of treating every patient with dignity and respect. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out. Dr. Maria Sanchez, a respected pediatrician, entered the room. "Dr. Collins, I heard about your clinic project. I'd like to volunteer my services," she said, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. Richard smiled warmly. "That's wonderful, Dr. Sanchez. Please, have a seat. I'd love to hear more about why you're interested in joining us." As they talked, Richard was impressed by Maria's passion for helping underprivileged children. She shared stories of her own experiences growing up in a low-income neighborhood, and how those memories fueled her desire to give back. "Your dedication is exactly what we need," Richard said, extending his hand. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Sanchez." Over the next few weeks, Richard continued to meet with potential team members. He sought out nurses, technicians, and administrative staff who demonstrated a genuine commitment to compassionate care. During one interview, Richard met with Jake, a young nurse with a bright smile and kind eyes. "I've always believed that healthcare should be accessible to everyone," Jake said earnestly. "When I heard about your clinic, I knew I had to be a part of it." Richard nodded approvingly. "That's the kind of attitude we need, Jake. Can you tell me about a time when you went above and beyond for a patient?" As Jake shared a touching story about comforting a scared child during a difficult procedure, Richard felt a sense of pride. He was building a team that truly cared about making a difference in people's lives. The day of the clinic's grand opening arrived, and Richard felt a mix of excitement and nervousness as he stood before the newly renovated building. The fresh paint gleamed in the morning sunlight, and a colorful banner hung above the entrance, welcoming all who needed care. As the doors opened, Richard was amazed to see a line of people already waiting. Families with young children, elderly couples supporting each other, and individuals from all walks of life stood patiently, hope shining in their eyes. "Good morning, everyone," Richard called out warmly. "Welcome to our clinic. We're here to help you." The first patient to enter was an elderly woman with a kind face etched with wrinkles. She approached Richard with a trembling hand. "Thank you, doctor," she said softly. "I've been putting off getting my heart checked for months because I couldn't afford it." Richard gently patted her hand. "You're in the right place now, ma'am. We'll take good care of you." As the day progressed, Richard and his team worked tirelessly to attend to each patient. They treated everything from common colds to more serious conditions, always taking the time to listen and provide compassionate care. During a brief lunch break, Richard stepped outside for some fresh air. He was overwhelmed by the sight of people still waiting patiently to be seen. Instead of feeling daunted, he felt a surge of pride and determination. "We're making a real difference," he thought to himself. "This is what healthcare should be about." Returning inside, Richard noticed Dr. Sanchez comforting a crying child, while Jake efficiently organized patient files. The teamwork and dedication he witnessed filled him with gratitude. As the day drew to a close, Richard felt exhausted but deeply satisfied. He had personally treated dozens of patients, each interaction reinforcing his commitment to providing equitable health care. Just before closing, a familiar face appeared at the reception desk. It was Gloria, holding Lily's hand. Richard's heart swelled with emotion as he approached them. "Dr. Collins," Gloria said with a warm smile, "we wanted to come and see the clinic for ourselves. What you're doing here is truly amazing." Richard felt a lump in his throat as he replied, "Thank you, Gloria. It means so much to hear that from you." As Gloria and Lily stood before him, Richard felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Gloria's eyes sparkled with health and gratitude, a stark contrast to the pain-filled gaze he remembered from their first encounter. Lily, holding her mother's hand, beamed up at Richard with admiration. "Dr. Collins," Gloria began, her voice soft but strong, "we wanted to come and thank you properly, not just for the clinic, but for everything you've done for us." Richard swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Gloria, I don't know what to say. You don't need to thank me. If anything, I should be thanking you." Gloria shook her head gently. "You saved my life, Dr. Collins. And more than that, you've changed so many lives with this clinic. Look around you." She gestured to the bustling waiting room. "These people have hope now because of you." Richard looked around, taking in the sight of patients being cared for with dignity and respect. He saw smiles where there once might have been fear or resignation. The realization of the impact he was making hit him full force. Lily tugged on Richard's coat, drawing his attention. "Dr. Collins, you're a real hero," she said, her eyes shining with admiration. "You made my mommy better, and now you're helping all these people too." Richard knelt down to Lily's level, his eyes misting over. "Lily, your mom is the real hero. She taught me one of the most important lessons of my life, that every person deserves compassion and care, no matter who they are or where they come from." Standing up, Richard addressed both Gloria and Lily. "Your visit means more to me than you could ever know. It reminds me why we're doing this, why it's so important." Gloria reached out and squeezed Richard's hand. "You've become the doctor and the person you were always meant to be, Dr. Collins. Never forget that." As Richard watched Gloria and Lily leave the clinic, he felt a profound sense of gratitude and purpose. Their visit had reinforced the importance of compassion in healthcare and in life. He turned back to the waiting room, ready to continue his work with renewed vigor and dedication. Years had passed since that fateful day when Gloria and Lily visited Richard's clinic. Now, on a warm summer evening, the school auditorium buzzed with excitement as families gathered for Lily's graduation ceremony. Richard sat in the audience, his heart swelling with pride as he watched the young woman Lily had become. As the principal introduced the guest speaker, Richard's breath caught in his throat. It was Gloria, looking radiant and healthy, stepping up to the podium. Her eyes scanned the crowd, meeting Richard's for a brief moment before she began her speech. "Good evening, everyone," Gloria started, her voice clear and strong. "I stand before you today not just as Lily's mother, but as someone who has experienced firsthand the power of compassion and empathy in our world." Gloria paused, taking a deep breath. "A few years ago, I faced a health crisis that nearly took my life. I was scared, alone, and feeling hopeless. But then something miraculous happened. A doctor who had once dismissed me had a change of heart." Richard felt tears welling up in his eyes as Gloria continued. Dr. Richard Collins and his medical team didn't just save my life. They showed me the true meaning of empathy. They taught me that a simple act of kindness, a moment of understanding, can change everything. Gloria's voice grew passionate as she addressed the graduating class. To all of you young people starting your journey into the world, remember this. Empathy has the power to transform lives. It can break down barriers, heal wounds, and create a better world for all of us. As Gloria spoke about the clinic Richard had opened and the lives it had touched, Richard felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He remembered the man he used to be and marveled at how far he had come. Dr. Collins's transformation, Gloria continued, her eyes finding Richard in the crowd again, is a testament to the fact that it's never too late to change, to become a better version of ourselves. His empathy didn't just save my life, it inspired a movement of compassion that continues to touch countless lives today. Richard listened, deeply moved by Gloria's words. He felt grateful for the journey that had brought him to this moment, and for the people who had shown him the true meaning of compassion. As Gloria's speech concluded, the auditorium erupted in applause. Richard wiped away a tear, his heart full of emotion. He glanced at Emily, seated beside him, and saw that she too was deeply moved by Gloria's words. After the ceremony, as families mingled and congratulated the graduates, Emily turned to her father with a determined look in her eyes. "Dad," she said, her voice filled with purpose, "I've made a decision." Richard looked at his daughter curiously. "What is it, sweetheart?" Emily took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. "I want to become a doctor, just like you. I want to help people and make a difference in their lives." Richard's eyes widened in surprise, and then a proud smile spread across his face. He placed his hands on Emily's shoulders, looking into her eyes. "Emily, that's wonderful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." Emily's eyes shone with excitement. "I've been thinking about it for a while now. Seeing how you've changed, how you've helped people like Gloria and so many others at the clinic, it's inspired me. I want to do the same." Richard pulled his daughter into a tight hug. As he held her, he felt a surge of love and pride. When they pulled apart, he looked at Emily with determination. "I promise you, Emily, I'll support you every step of the way," Richard declared. "I'll make sure you have everything you need to become the kind of doctor who truly cares for her patients, who serves with compassion and integrity." Emily beamed at her father's words. "Thanks, Dad. I want to be the kind of doctor who sees people for who they are, not just their symptoms or their background. I want to make a real difference, like you have." Richard felt his heart swell with pride. He realized that his journey of transformation had not only changed him, but had also inspired his daughter to follow a path of compassion and service. Years had passed since that fateful graduation day. Now Dr. Richard Collins stood in the bustling clinic he had founded, watching with pride as his daughter, Dr. Emily Collins, tended to a patient. The small examination room was filled with warmth and compassion, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile environment Richard had once cultivated in his practice. As Emily finished up with her patient, an elderly woman with a kind smile, Richard approached her. "How's Mrs. Johnson doing?" he asked, his voice gentle and caring. Emily beamed at her father. "She's doing much better. Her blood pressure is under control, and she's following her treatment plan perfectly." Richard nodded, a sense of fulfillment washing over him. He looked around the clinic, taking in the diverse faces of patients waiting to be seen. People from all walks of life sat side by side, each receiving the same level of care and respect. As they walked together to the next examination room, Richard felt a wave of emotion. He paused, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "You know, Emily," he said softly, "I've learned so much since we started this clinic, but the most important lesson has been that true healing comes from the heart." Emily smiled at her father, understanding the depth of his words. "I know, Dad. You've taught me that every day." Richard's eyes misted over as he looked at the clinic around them. This place had become more than just a medical facility. It was a symbol of his redemption, a testament to his commitment to serving humanity without barriers. As they entered the next room to see their patient, Richard felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had come so far from the prejudiced doctor he once was, and now, working alongside his daughter, he was living proof that change was possible. The clinic stood as a beacon of hope, not just for the patients it served, but for anyone who believed in the power of compassion and the possibility of personal growth. Would you have forgiven Dr. Richard Collins if you were in Gloria's position? Yes or no? Let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to my channel. I am spending hours upon hours writing these heartwarming stories for you, and your support is what keeps me going.